10 universal principles. We have principles of justice and natural rights, the principle of natural rights, and the principle of fundamentality of rights, and the principle of limits to freedom. And those are his final 3 ethical and moral standards which he evaluates things. The principle of justice and natural rights. He says, all human beings in themselves, by virtue of their existence alone, have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and property ownership. No government gives these rights, and no government can take them away. And that, remember, all of these principles interact with each other. We talked about the principle of definition, if you will, where you can't add on extra criteria of personhood to define a human being. So you cannot exclude people who are functioning at a low level or people who are at a particular stage of development, because we also had the whole principle regarding the maximum actualization by which you judge the nature and value of a person. Principles of justice and natural rights. Justice is the foundation of law and civil order. It was first defined by Plato, so again, we're talking about concepts of Western civilization that are over 3,000 years old. Plato talked about justice being what is the good for each member of the community. And there's been tradition that we need to resist unjust laws, both to protect victims, okay, like in slavery, for example, as well as to shore up the legal system, because if unjust laws are allowed to exist and the authority is allowed to continue with them, the entirety of the legal system starts to devolve into essential anarchy. The principle of natural rights. Again, we talked briefly yesterday. If you wonder why there's always this pushback to the church of the church should stay out of the public square, the church should stay out of the schools, we should not talk about the history of Western civilization in the context of the contributions of Christianity. You can see why some of these rights were first articulated and brought forth to the greater community through the church, and even to this day, the church brings that moral voice and a philosophical voice to analyze the culture and to judge some of the things that occur within our society. The principle of natural rights was first articulated by Francisco Suarez. He was a Jesuit. He was a widely read, one of the most popular philosophers of his day. And so throughout all of the academies, he was well read, and he influenced John Locke. When I was reading this book, I was thinking, wow, it's been a long time since I thought about John Locke, probably like in college, or maybe I was first introduced to him in high school. I was thinking, I wonder if today kids even know who John Locke was, and whether that type of thing and information is actually transmitted. Locke formulated the theory of natural rights, okay? Super influential writing. He influenced Jefferson specifically, and Jefferson is the person, of course, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator. People will say, well, Jefferson was an atheist, or Jefferson was just a deist, or Jefferson wasn't, or the founding fathers weren't religious. Whatever their particular bents were, the words that Jefferson wrote and that were endorsed by the other signers say, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He also said that a right is something that a man had as his own, that he could exercise in his own name, and that could not be taken away from him that could only be taken away from him with injustice. So, you go to the next slide. In other words, if you have these rights, the rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, the only way that anyone can tamper with them is through unjust law or unjust relationships. So to take away my right to life, if you do that, you're going to, by the very nature of taking away something that's inalienable to me, you are going to have to use some mechanism or create a situation of injustice. The state or governing body does not, I did say, I do, as I told you guys, those of you for all three, okay? This is the first time I've done this presentation, and as I told you on Sunday, you guys are my guinea pigs. Yeah. And it's funny, you look at these things, and if it doesn't have a red line under it, I don't notice it as an error, you know, and so you can't confer rights or manuals on individuals. No rights, nothing new. The state or governing body does not confer rights on individuals, which would allow the state to take away these rights. That's one of the very significant concepts that's occurring right now. With the whole idea of religious liberty and the free exercise of religion, you hear a lot of messaging from the government, from the federal government, that this is the way it's going to be, and this is how we are going to tamper with what you can do as a Catholic hospital, Catholic institution, Catholic medical provider, because we're giving you the permission. We're telling you how you're going to act. But if these rights are inalienable, they're not. That's not the situation. The situation in reality, if we understand that these rights are inalienable to each one of us as citizens, is that each of us relinquish some of our rights for the case of social order, for making sure that society can operate in an orderly fashion. But we are relinquishing our rights. I'm saying, okay, I'll pay into the Medicare system so that health care can be provided, blah, 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 that sort of way. It's not the case of the government having the right to tell me essentially and existentially what I am to do or not do. Rights belong to the individual by their very existence. That unborn baby has the same amount of right in terms of natural life rights as I do, you do, or Terry Shiloh does. And the state cannot take away the rights without injustice. Terry Shiloh's right to life was taken away through the injustice of denying her water and food so that she starved and dehydrated to death. Suarez holds that all governments have the same end and purpose, the due preservation and natural perfection of, or happiness of human nature. So that governments are not created for the development of the industrial capital of a particular geographic region. Governments are not created for the subjugation of a particular people in colonial status. Governments have the same end and purpose in that the due preservation and natural perfection or happiness of human nature, and that presupposes that the right to life is there, that people are free to pursue their own way of making themselves happy. Principle of natural rights are foundational in the Declaration of Independence. If you look at that preamble, we hold these truths to be self-evident that, okay, all men are created equal, etc., etc. That is where the natural law is declared in our constitutional documents. By the time we get to the Constitution starts to say, okay, since we all understand that we have these rights that we declared in the Declaration of Independence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then we can go on to, in the Constitution, to describe the types of law that would be permitted. So the Constitution is more contractual, if you look at it, even within the preamble of it. We also see principles of natural rights being incorporated into the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And that was a document that was created post-World War II. Yeah, natural, right? Okay. Why is this important? The duty to uphold the Constitution is only properly understood in the context of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, if only the Constitution is used to determine authority, then it becomes an exercise in the arbitrary use of power. And if you go back on the Dred Scott and the Roe v. Wade cases, and we looked at those a little bit yesterday, all right, remember, they focused only in, well, there's been no constitutional law decisions about the status of the fetus, so therefore, we have to presume that we don't have any consensus on the status of the fetus, so therefore we're not going to even address that. We're going to talk about other issues. Dred Scott also did not look at the African American as an individual, as a person with natural rights, that there were other laws and rules within the Constitution that said how we were going to interact with these people. They only looked at the Constitution and said, well, the Constitution didn't say anything about the status of slaves being brought to this country, therefore we're going to rule in the way that they did, that the black man is not equal and can be subjugated by the dominant race. And they were able to justify that only by keeping the paradigm limited to the Constitution and ignoring the context of the Declaration of Independence, where the natural rights are actually stated. The implications from Roe: the court could sanction any penalty for any particular group of human beings simply because the Constitution did not explicitly mention, I see the typo, them as persons, okay? So they could say, well, the Constitution doesn't explicitly mention left-handed people, and therefore all left-handed people can be excluded from the public school system. The Constitution doesn't explicitly mention blondes, so all blondes will have to leave the country. That's how they got away with the Roe decision, by limiting the scope. The court did not respect the natural rights of all human beings. It shifted its burden of proof from showing why human beings should not be considered persons to why human beings should be considered persons, okay? The presumption of natural rights is I as a human being, and now validated by scientific advancement, I have a unique human genome. I am continuing to grow within a natural environment. I am a human person. Remember from the very first day we talked about this, that in common law, in common understanding, as well as a consequence of human reproduction, we would suspect that human reproduction would lead to a human. A human being and a being and a person are synonymous. Here, the impact of Roe shifted. They said, well, we don't really know what the status of that is, so we're not going to address the rights of that being the human embryo or fetus. It undermines the law as having the sole purpose of the service of justice. If you deny the rights of one party within a contract or within a situation, you automatically set up a situation of injustice. Right. The second of the natural rights, the principle of fundamentality of rights. The more fundamental right is the one which is necessary for the possibility of the other. Where there is a conflict, we should resolve in favor of the more fundamental right. And this speaks directly to, well, it's my body, it's my right to choose, I can do what I want, and it's my liberty and my pursuit of my happiness that allows me to take the life of the human person growing within me. Okay, it's the denial of this whole dimension within philosophy of the more fundamental right having precedence over subsequent rights. So, by denying the status of the embryo or the fetus, we then have a situation where we don't have to deal with the privacy of the right to life of that person. So the court ruled my right to happiness takes precedence. So if I want to abort the child, I can do that, right? The problem in that thinking is that the right to life is the most fundamental right. Once we, again, through common sense, through scientific understanding, acknowledge the being and the personhood of the developing embryo or fetus, all right, that right to life should supersede my right as a mother to the pursuit of happiness and my own choices. The principle of fundamentality of rights, there is implicit priority of the right to self-preservation over the right to the natural perfection of the human state. So although it may be inconvenient for either mother or perhaps the father who might be supporting this child, may be inconvenient, or it might not be in keeping with my plan and my vision of my life, the right to self-preservation or life of the child should be put as precedent. This will come into play at the end of life too, where people will say, well, taking care of people who are really sick and old takes a great deal of resources from the society, and that will impact negatively on the younger population's ability to either get some basic health care, the argument will be made, or to pursue educational goals. There'll be an argument made like that. And they'll say, that's why we'll keep you comfortable as we withhold treatment or ration treatment or whatever's going to happen here. This right, the right to self-preservation of all of us, because we are all created equal and all have the right to life, should take precedence over other considerations as decisions and policy is being developed. The right to life is conditioned for the possibility of the right to liberty, but the right of liberty is not a precondition for the right to life. So we can talk all we want about my happiness, but if I have to kill someone or take their life in order to do that, then we need to rule in favor of right to life. Someone else's right of liberty should never presuppose the most fundamental. The principle of fundamentality of rights, important in the resolution of rights conflicts, grows an unjust decision because it justifies the indisputably primary right to life, and there's compromise in the objective fundamentality of rights, setting the stage for, do we have a right to have euthanasia, do we have a right to physician-assisted suicide, etc. The principle of limits to freedom. One person's or groups of freedoms cannot impose undue burdens upon persons or groups. And this is an extension of the idea of quote, natural rights. And again, right conflict and trying to figure out what takes precedence within society over what. Jann Armantrout very succinctly said, one person's liberty stops where another person's rights begin. I like that. Mm-hmm. And Montesquieu had a similar perspective. Government must not grant freedoms to one group of individuals that will likely create undue burdens for others, and I see the missing age there as well, or threaten the safety of others. So, especially at end-of-life decision-making, people will say, look, if you don't want physician-assisted suicide, if you don't want to participate in euthanasia, just don't do it. But it should be my right to be able to exercise my choice to end my life. And this is the argument, you hear that drumbeat argument over and over and over again. You need to look at what undue burdens for others mean, okay? If we create that right for physician-assisted suicide, okay, to one group of individuals who say, we want this, is that likely to create undue burdens for others? Let's look at physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia. Who could that then create undue burdens for? It could create undue burdens for the elderly, who feel that they are becoming a burden upon society or their families. It can be used to express burdensomeness for the healthcare system, whether we are going to allow the last year of life to be the most expensive year of treatment. And you can say, well, then we need to, that pressure can withhold duration treatment. It can create burden upon providers, whether or not they will be able to really accept patients and clients if they need extensive rehabilitative, debilitative, or medical services. So natural rights becomes very important, and we need to make sure that limits on freedom aren't creating undue burdens, or extensions of freedom do not create undue burden. Abortion is an undue burden to the developing child, of course, and legalization of assisted suicide has the potential to place undue burden on the most vulnerable to die. All right, now, after all of these kind of, at times, seems almost human rights that we've been through, you know, like they seem a little bit variations on one another. Father Spitzer wraps up his book with saying, but the most fundamental principle of all of these is the principle of beneficence, which I have no problem saying. I don't know why I can't say the other word. And it is an aim at to add optimal contribution to others and to society. It is, remember we said, I can't say it. No, that's what I say.
Beneficence.
Non-maleficence.
Non-maleficence. Okay. Was the silver rule. Do not do unto others what you would not have done unto you. Okay. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that this is the big kahuna of all of the universal principles. Next one. Jesus expanded that silver rule. It's within, in the history of theology and philosophy, is Jesus' contribution of his life and his presence in being that gives us the golden rule. The moral, ethical life is to be more than avoiding negative actions. Jesus wanted a transformation of the human heart towards a genuine love of one's neighbor. Okay, so it's got to be more than just doing no harm, but also being proactive and moving forward to actually give something else to your neighbor. The golden rule gave rise to more positive cultural transformation than any other single ethical teaching in history. And if you go back even to the first chapters of Acts, where the deacons were developed to actually distribute food, you're starting to see a charitable expression of Jesus' command to love one neighbor as oneself. If you look at the history of religions, there is not a lot of charity of that degree known within even the Old Testament, while hospitality was certainly something to be encouraged, as far as going out to take care of the sick, the suffering. And one of the reasons why the Good Samaritan story was so startling was that here is Jesus calling for, regardless of who that person, patient, client, victim is, you're to go out and take care of them, to extend yourself further. Publicly accessible hospitals and schools, because we're to love our neighbors as ourselves, and also to pray for one's enemies, to do good to one's enemies through Christianity. That's what created actually publicly accessible hospitals and schools. The first hospitals were Christian hospitals in Rome. I think it's Santa Maria Sofia was the first hospital in Rome, and it was set up for pilgrims coming to Rome. The first pharmacy was in the Burgundy region of France, and it was the nuns who had a great deal of skill with herbs and medicinals of the day. And certainly we know the history of schools through the academies that were set up through religious orders. Justice theory, natural rights theory, social justice theory, and you could go on and on, are a direct extension of the golden rule. It's the reason why Christianity had such a tremendous impact upon Western civilization. It's also why we need to be careful when people say, well, all religions are equal. There's more than one path to God, and we're all worshiping the same God. If we look critically at world religions, all of them, and I think this was articulated by Pope John Paul II, all contain some elements of truth, all contain some pathway towards God. But they have radically different dimensions to their implications in our living here on earth. For example, in Hindu culture and religion, there's that caste system, and they believe in reincarnation, that you come back as a product of the choices that you've made in your previous life. And if you come back handicapped or in a very frail condition, that's a result of your bad karma, okay, of what you've done in your previous life. And so if you are suffering, all right, then it's better for me not to intervene, because if you suffer and go through that whole process of this life, then perhaps in your next life you will come back at a higher order and in a more comfortable position. That's a radically different notion than I have compassion on that person because I want them to me, I want them to that other what I would want them to me. It's one of the reasons why, to this day, you don't have an adequate hospital system in Hindu countries like India, but you see Christian charities still able to move in, and where they do a lot of their best evangelization is through schools and through hospital and medical care. I think we're almost done. Okay, go ahead. And we are. He wraps up the book, and I did not want to go into this because I don't think I could do it justice. And if you remember Maslow's theory of development, whether when first you have getting your basic needs met and it goes on to contribute to society, or you seek the purity of truth and beauty, all those things. His concluding chapter, and I almost felt as though that he was philosophizing at this point, okay? That what's occurring in our culture today is not only the legal implications of all of this that's guiding our institutions and creating the problems that we have dealt with during the course of this conference, but there is another dynamic going on where there are forces that are keeping people at maybe that second level of development, beyond your essential needs to things that might enrich your life. And there's manipulation occurring that's keeping people stuck so that people are very competitive, that the most important values to them are, do I have as nice a car as Bob does, or do I have, as many dresses as you do? And that there's a lot of marketing and a lot of pressure within the culture to keep people kind of quibbling at that level so that they never really take that look at what's happening in the overarching culture and in the power structures. It's a very interesting discussion, and the several times I've been down here, people have said, so where do we go from here after this conference? And I'm thinking about it and reading that and thinking, maybe we need to study that out over a long period of time and see, how do you break through that? How do you help somebody see that they're being manipulated by advertisements and media and all this stuff? And where do we bring our voice of church up higher that affirms and tells us you are a valuable child of God and you have much to contribute beyond what the color of your house is or what doodads you have for decoration? And that's a very big question. So it's worth the read of the book, or if you don't read the whole book and you get the book, that last chapter is worth really contemplating on this discussion of all this. So how do we break through this kind of self-gratification culture that certainly is perpetuated by many strong forces within our society? I know that Deacon Claude, when he and I first talked about this, had envisioned hundreds of people coming every day, and I only wish that they had. What I do know is that you are probably now some of the best educated people in the country because you have seen some of the best and brightest people in the country coming through here giving speeches. I do not consider myself in that class, but those big ones, okay, that came doing things. You have a lot of information from a lot of different dimensions about the situation that we are in, armed with knowledge, realizing that the battle is ours to fight, but the war is the Lord's, that somehow we have to find a way that we can be helpful, but we're not going to be able to turn things around by ourselves or through the best strategy or through the best knowledge. We need to rely on God. We need to rely on prayer. I know that we're at a very interesting point within the life of our diocese. as a new administration and bishop comes to lead the flock, that there will be changes and opportunity always exists during a time of change. So I really hope that the knowledge that was imparted at this conference has a chance to really blossom over the next year. I thank you for your time and attention. I'll take any questions or comments if you have.